2013, the morning air over the regional airport was clear and calm. The sun had just begun to rise, painting the runway in soft orange light. Among the small group of pilots preparing for the day's flight stood a man in his early 30s. He had the calm, focused look of someone who'd spent half his life in the cockpit. Everyone around the airport knew him as a man who loved the skies more than anything else in the world. That morning, he wasn't scheduled for any passenger flights. Instead, he was helping two young trainee pilots prepare for a short training exercise over the nearby mountain range. They had been under his supervision for several months, and both were eager to prove themselves. He had reviewed their plans carefully, checked the weather updates twice, and even inspected the small twin-engine plane himself before they took off. Everything seemed fine. Calm winds, clear visibility, and a routine route they had flown many times before. The young pilots climbed aboard, smiling with excitement. He gave them a final nod, a small pat on the shoulder, and said, "Fly safe. Remember, the weather can change fast near the ridge." They laughed lightly, confident and bright-eyed, before closing the cockpit door. He stood by the runway, watching their plane accelerate and lift off. The engines hummed smoothly, the aircraft rising gracefully into the pale blue morning. Within minutes, it was just a silver dot gliding toward the horizon. An hour later, everything changed. Around mid-morning, the control tower received a faint, broken transmission. The operator frowned, pressing a hand to his headset. The message was hard to understand, but one thing was clear. The voice on the radio was panicked. It was one of the trainee pilots calling out for help. "Mayday, mayday. We're losing altitude. Visibility dropping." The message broke apart with heavy static. The operator called out to the pilot who had trained them. Within minutes, he was inside the tower, eyes scanning the radar screen. The small blip representing their aircraft flickered, then vanished completely. No signal, no response, nothing. Just silence. The control tower quickly declared an emergency. Nearby air bases and rescue teams were contacted. Helicopters were scrambled. The man who had trained them insisted on joining the search. He knew those mountains better than most pilots. He had flown over them hundreds of times. He couldn't just stand by. By noon, clouds had rolled in, heavy and dark, and winds began to pick up. The mountains were wrapped in mist, making visibility poor. Despite the conditions, the search continued. For 2 long days, teams scoured the valleys, rivers, and ridgelines. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no signal, not even a trace of oil or debris. It was as if the plane had simply vanished into thin air. He didn't sleep much during those days. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard the faint voice of his trainee over the radio, calling for help he couldn't give. He replayed every step in his mind, checking the flight plan, the instruments, the weather. He kept asking himself what he missed, what he could have done differently. By the 3rd day, the search was officially suspended due to worsening weather. The authorities promised to resume once the skies cleared, but deep down, everyone knew the truth. In the rugged terrain and freezing temperatures, survival chances dropped with every passing hour. Weeks turned into months. The families of the missing pilots came to the airport often at first, desperate for updates. He met with them, offered words of comfort that felt hollow even to his own ears. One of the families brought him a photograph of their son, smiling proudly in his pilot uniform. He kept that picture in his locker, though it became harder to look at over time. Eventually, the search was called off completely. The official report listed possible engine failure and loss of visibility as the likely cause. But without wreckage, no one could be certain. Some said the plane might have gone down into a hidden valley that was impossible to reach. Others whispered that the storm that day had created strange wind currents known to pull small aircraft off course. He stopped flying for a while after that. The sound of a radio crackling or the faint smell of jet fuel would bring back memories too strong to bear. His friends at the airport tried to encourage him to return, reminding him that flying was his life. But he couldn't bring himself to step into a cockpit, not yet. Months later, he finally did, not out of desire but out of necessity. Bills had to be paid, and the only thing he truly knew how to do was fly. He joined a smaller airline, taking shorter routes, often flying cargo instead of passengers. He preferred the quiet. No chatter, no questions, no one to see the sadness he carried. On one of his first flights back, he caught sight of the same mountain range in the distance. For a moment he froze, his hands tightening around the controls. The sunlight reflected off the peaks, bright and cruel, reminding him of what had been lost there. He quickly looked away, forcing his focus back to the gauges in front of him. In time, people stopped talking about the missing flight. A new generation of pilots joined, and the tragedy faded from memory. But not for him. Every time he flew near those mountains, he felt a chill run through him. He often tuned into the emergency frequency out of habit, listening for static, though he never admitted that to anyone. Sometimes he thought he heard faint voices through the noise, but he would tell himself it was just his imagination, or the natural hum of the radio. A few years later, a journalist reached out, asking to interview him for a story about aviation mysteries. He politely declined. He didn't want the past dug up or sensationalized. He had lived it once, and that was enough. Still, late at night, he would sometimes take long drives to the edge of the airfield, park near the runway, and watch the planes taking off into the dark. The lights would rise one after another, disappearing into the clouds. He would sit there for hours just staring at the empty sky. He wondered where the missing plane had gone, and whether the young pilots had known what was happening in their final moments. He never stopped feeling responsible. Even though everyone told him it wasn't his fault, he carried that weight quietly, tucked behind the calm expression he wore every day. Years passed. The world moved on. New technology made flying safer, radios clearer, and tracking systems more precise. But the mountains remained the same, silent, vast and indifferent sometimes on quiet mornings. When the first rays of sunlight touched the hangar doors, he thought he could almost hear the faint echo of that last Mayday call, drifting through time. It came and went in an instant, but it always left his heart heavy. He told no one about it. Some things he believed weren't meant to be explained. What he didn't know was that 10 years later, fate would lead him back to that same sky, over those same mountains, where the silence would finally break, and the past he thought was gone forever would call out to him once more. 10 years can pass quietly, yet leave behind the same ache that once felt fresh. For the pilot, the years after the disappearance were slow, heavy, and filled with quiet skies. The sound of an engine or the soft crackle of a radio still brought back memories he tried to bury. He had changed airlines twice since that time. His current job was with a private cargo company that flew mostly at night. It was steady work and paid the bills, but he had chosen it for a different reason: the night sky. Fewer people, fewer voices, fewer reminders. The darkness felt calm to him, like a place where questions could float without needing answers. At the airport, most people knew him as quiet, but dependable. He didn't talk much about his past, and few ever asked. The new pilots admired him because he was calm under pressure, always patient with younger crew members, and never raised his voice, no matter how tense things got. But when he was alone in the cockpit flying through the dark, his thoughts often drifted back to that morning in 2013, the way the sunlight hit the plane's wings, the excited smiles of the two young pilots, and the sound of their last message fading into static. He had never forgotten that sound. Sometimes he still dreamed of it. In those dreams, he would be sitting in his own plane, hearing their Mayday call again and again, but this time he could never respond. The radio buttons wouldn't work. His voice wouldn't come out, and as the dream ended, the silence would swallow everything, leaving only the hum of the engines. When he woke from those dreams, he would lie still for a long time, listening to the night around him. He lived alone in a small apartment not far from the airport. The walls were lined with old flight manuals, maps, and pictures of aircraft he had flown. There was one photograph he kept in a frame, two smiling faces standing beside a training plane. He never told anyone who they were, but every pilot who visited his place noticed the picture and seemed to understand it was something he didn't want to discuss. Over the years, the missing flight became a local legend among aviation circles. People would sometimes bring it up casually in hangar conversations, wondering aloud if the wreckage would ever be found. Someone always had a theory. Maybe the plane went off course and crashed deep in the valley, maybe it got caught in a downdraft, or maybe something stranger had happened. He would quietly listen, then walk away. The truth, he believed, was buried somewhere only the sky knew. Despite everything, he never lost his skill. His hands still moved with precision, his instincts sharp as ever. Flying came to him as naturally as breathing. But there was something different in the way he handled planes. Now a deep caution that came from knowing how quickly things could go wrong. He had learned to find comfort In small things, the smell of coffee before a night flight, the soft vibration of the engine under his hands, the sight of distant city lights glowing far below. These moments reminded him that flying wasn't just a job. It was still a calling, even if it came with ghosts. Sometimes, after landing late at night, he would stay in the cockpit a few minutes longer before shutting everything down. The radio would still be on, filling the silence with faint static. He would listen quietly, almost hoping to hear something, though he didn't know what. Then he would smile sadly and switch it off. One evening, as he walked through the hangar after a long flight, one of the young mechanics called out, "Hey, there's a reporter asking about that old mountain crash. Said she's writing an anniversary story." He felt his stomach tighten slightly but only nodded. "Tell her I'm not the right person to talk to." The mechanic shrugged and went back to work. The pilot walked past the dim lights of the hangar, his footsteps echoing against the concrete floor. He hated how people turned tragedies into stories. For him, it wasn't a mystery. It was a wound that never really healed. Later that night, as he drove home, he found himself taking a different route. The road wound upward, toward a lookout point that faced the mountains. It was quiet there, with only the soft whistle of the wind. He parked his car and stepped out, staring at the dark shapes of the mountains in the distance. They looked peaceful, almost gentle, but he knew their silence hid something deeper. Somewhere out there, hidden under years of snow and rock, lay the answers he'd never found. He thought about turning back many times in the past, about organizing one more search, using new technology or satellite scans. But each time something held him back. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the belief that the mountains wouldn't give up their secrets just because he asked. His friends had moved on. Some had families, others had retired. He was still flying, still chasing the horizon every night, carrying a story no one else could truly understand. On a quiet night flight a few years later, he found himself over those same mountains again. It wasn't planned. His route had been changed due to weather elsewhere. He looked at the navigation screen and his heart skipped when he saw the familiar coordinates. For a long moment he hesitated, staring through the cockpit window at the dark shapes below. The moonlight reflected off the snowy ridges, just enough to reveal the same landscape he had searched years ago. His co-pilot, a younger man, noticed his silence. "Everything okay, sir?" He nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." He didn't say what about. As they flew on, a sudden wave of emotion came over him. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the memories. Maybe it was the sense that some part of the past was still waiting for him. After landing that night, he couldn't sleep. He sat in his apartment, the radio on low volume beside him, tuned to the old emergency frequency. It was mostly static, soft, rhythmic, like the sound of wind brushing against metal. He knew it was silly, but sometimes that sound brought him peace. It felt like a quiet connection to the people he had lost. Years passed like this, routine flights, quiet nights, and a heart that had learned to live with unanswered questions. He stopped waiting for closure. Life had a way of moving forward even when the past refused to let go. But one evening, while sorting through old logbooks, he found a small piece of paper tucked between the pages. It was from the day of the disappearance. On it, he had written the last recorded position of the missing flight, their final transmission coordinates. His handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly smudged. He stared at those numbers for a long time, tracing them with his finger. He wondered if anyone else had ever looked at them since. Probably not. The investigation had ended years ago. The world had forgotten. Something stirred in him that night. Not guilt this time, but curiosity, or maybe fate. He opened his laptop and searched for recent satellite images of the area. The resolution was better now than it had been a decade ago. As he scrolled through the images, he noticed something unusual near one of the ridges, a faint metallic glimmer in the sunlight. It could have been nothing, but his chest tightened all the same. He closed the laptop slowly and leaned back in his chair. The city outside was quiet, the sky clear. He wondered if he was imagining things. Maybe he was just tired chasing ghosts again, but somewhere deep down he felt that strange pull, the same feeling he'd had on the day the plane vanished. He didn't know it yet, but the mountains were about to speak again. And when they did, their voice would come through the one thing he had never stopped listening to, the radio. It was a quiet night in 2023. One of those calm evenings when the sky seemed endless and the stars felt close enough to touch. The pilot sat in the cockpit of his cargo plane, watching the runway lights fade behind him as the aircraft lifted gently into the dark sky. It was a routine flight, just a few crates of supplies to be delivered across the region. He had done this route hundreds of times before, but tonight felt different. The air seemed heavier somehow, quieter than usual. Maybe it was just his mood, or maybe it was because the flight path crossed right over the same mountain range where everything had changed 10 years earlier. He hadn't flown over that area in a long time. The last time he did, it had brought back too many memories. But this time he had no choice. The alternate route was closed due to bad weather elsewhere. He had checked the forecast carefully. Clear skies, no storms, smooth air. Still, he couldn't shake off a strange feeling as he adjusted the controls and climbed to cruising altitude. The co-pilot sitting beside him was younger, full of energy, chatting now and then about his plans for the weekend. The pilot smiled politely, responding when needed, but most of his focus stayed on the instruments. He had always trusted his instincts, and right now they were telling him to stay alert. The plane moved steadily through the darkness, the stars glinting above like scattered sparks. The radio crackled now and then with routine updates from air traffic control. Everything seemed normal. Around midnight, they reached the stretch above the mountains. The view below was pitch black, with only faint outlines of peaks visible in the moonlight. He looked down, his hands tightening slightly around the yoke. Somewhere down there, hidden under snow and rock, was the place that had haunted him for a decade. He tried to focus on the present, adjusting a few settings and checking their coordinates. Then suddenly a faint noise came through the radio. Static at first, then a few broken sounds. He frowned and turned up the volume. The static grew louder, mixed with what sounded like a distant voice. It was weak, almost like an echo. The co-pilot glanced over. "Is that interference?" he asked. "Maybe," the pilot said quietly, leaning closer to the speaker. "Let's check the frequency." They were tuned to the main communication channel. The pilot adjusted the dial slightly, but the sound didn't disappear. Instead, it became clearer. A man's voice, faint and shaky, broke through the static. "Mayday, Mayday, we're losing power. Visibility dropping fast." The pilot froze. His heart pounded as the words sank in. He had heard that exact message before, word for word. The co-pilot looked puzzled. "What was that?" "Did someone just... Don't touch anything," the pilot said quickly. His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling slightly. He knew those words. He had written them down 10 years ago in a report no one had believed. He checked the clock, 12:07 a.m. Then he glanced at the navigation screen. They were flying almost directly over the last known coordinates of the missing flight. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Mayday, engine 1 failing. Descending. We're..." Static swallowed the rest. The co-pilot grabbed the headset. "Control, this is cargo flight 217 requesting confirmation. Do you copy?" "We're picking up an emergency transmission on channel 121.5. There was a pause. Then the air traffic controller replied, sounding confused. "Cargo 217 negative. We show no emergency traffic in your sector. Repeat, no distress calls have been reported." The co-pilot looked at the pilot, unsure. Could it be a recording or something? He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the dark horizon. He adjusted the frequency again, hoping for more clarity. The voice came one last time, faint but unmistakable. "We're losing power. Descending fast. Coordinates." The rest dissolved into a long stretch of static, then silence. The pilot sat back, staring straight ahead. His throat felt dry. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The co-pilot finally said, "That was strange. Maybe some old signal bouncing back?" He nodded slowly, but he knew better. The words, the tone, even the static between the sentences. It was all the same as the transmission from 10 years ago. He could never forget it. After landing, he filed an official report with the control tower. The staff on duty were polite but dismissive. "Could have been a radio echo," one of them said. "Sometimes signals get trapped in the atmosphere and bounce around. Happens more than you think." He didn't argue. He just nodded and thanked them before leaving. But as he walked out into the cool night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that what he'd heard wasn't just a random signal. It had come from the same area, at the same time of night, using the same emergency frequency. The next morning he went back to his apartment and pulled out his old flight logs. The handwriting was faded, but the details were still clear. He ran his finger across the coordinates written on that paper, the last known position of the missing training plane. Then he compared them to the location where he'd heard the signal the night before. They matched almost perfectly. For a long time, he just sat there staring at the numbers. The world outside went on as usual, cars passing by, birds chirping. But inside his thoughts were racing. He couldn't let it go. He contacted an old friend who still worked at the aviation office and explained what happened. His friend promised to look into it, though he sounded doubtful. Later that day, the friend called back. "There's nothing in the records," he said. "No aircraft logged any distress calls. The frequency was clear all night except for yours." The pilot thanked him, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. That night, he went back to the airport, long after most people had gone home. He sat in his parked car, watching the runway lights blink in the distance. The radio in his hand was tuned to the same frequency, 121.5 MHz, the International Emergency Channel. Static filled the air, soft and steady. He closed his eyes, listening. Minutes passed, nothing but white noise. Then, just as he was about to switch it off, a faint click echoed through the speaker, like someone keying a mic. He held his breath. A whisper came through, barely audible. "Losing altitude, Mayday." He opened his eyes wide. The sound faded instantly, his pulse raced. He turned the volume up, scanning the airwaves again, but there was only static now. He sat there for nearly an hour, waiting. The night felt colder. The empty runway stretched out in front of him like a dark river. Finally, he whispered to himself, "It's not possible." But deep down, he knew it was real. The voice was the same as before, the same tone, the same fear. It hadn't been a random echo. It was something else, something beyond explanation. For the first time in years, he felt the old guilt return. Maybe the signal had been trying to reach him all along. Maybe it had waited until he was flying over that same sky again. He didn't sleep at all that night. When the morning light filled the room, he pulled out a map and spread it across the table. He marked the coordinates again, then stared at the spot where the voice had come from. The mountains had kept their secret for 10 years. But now it seemed they were finally speaking. He didn't know what he would find if he went back there, but something inside him said he had to. Whatever had happened that night a decade ago hadn't ended. It had only been waiting, and now it had started again. The days after the strange transmission were restless ones for the pilot. He tried to go about his usual flights, but his mind refused to stay focused. Every time he looked out over the mountains, he thought of that voice, the same desperate call from a decade ago. The same words, the same fear. He began to replay the sound in his head over and over again. The exact pauses, the tone, the faint static before the words broke through. He could almost hear it now, even when the radio was off. It had been so real. Too real to be a coincidence. A few days later, he went to the aviation office again. The man at the front desk recognized him and smiled politely. But when the pilot mentioned the distress call, the man's face turned serious. "You again?" he asked, trying to sound gentle. "Sir, we checked all logs. There were no active distress signals that night." "It could have been a radio bounce. I've flown for 20 years, the pilot said quietly. "That wasn't a bounce. It was a real voice." The man hesitated but didn't argue. "I believe you heard something, but there's no official record of it. If you want, I can pass this to the technical department for analysis." He nodded. "Please do that." That night, he sat in his apartment going through every note, every map, every bit of information from the old case. The coordinates where the missing plane disappeared matched almost exactly with where he had heard the voice. It couldn't be random. The next morning, he called an old contact, a retired air traffic controller who had been on duty the day the training flight vanished 10 years ago. The man sounded surprised to hear from him after so long. "I remember that day like it was yesterday," the controller said over the phone. "We tried everything, but the signal just vanished." "You were there, remember? You stayed with us all night." "I remember," the pilot said quietly. "I heard the same transmission again. A week ago." The line went silent for a few seconds. Then the old controller spoke slowly, his voice low and cautious. "That's not possible, I know, but I heard it. Do you still have the exact time and coordinates?" "Yes." "Then meet me tomorrow. Let's look at it together." The next afternoon, they met at a small cafe near the old airport. The controller was older now, his hair white and his hands shaky, but his mind was sharp as ever. They spread out maps and flight charts on the table, the same kind they had used a decade ago. The pilot pointed to the coordinates. "Right here," he said. "This is where I was when I heard the signal again." The old controller adjusted his glasses. "That's almost the same grid where we lost contact back then." He nodded. "Exactly," the controller looked thoughtful. "You know, I once read about something called radio trapping. Under certain conditions, humidity, magnetic interference, or solar activity, old signals can get trapped in the atmosphere and reappear later." "But 10 years? I've never heard of that lasting so long." The pilot leaned back. "Then maybe it's not trapped in the air. Maybe it's still coming from down there." The controller raised his eyebrows. "You think the wreckage is still transmitting?" "Maybe. Some emergency beacons run on backup power or get reactivated by weather changes. It's unlikely, but not impossible." The controller looked down at the maps again. "You want to check it out, don't you?" The pilot didn't need to answer. The look on his face said it all. 2 days later, they arranged a small trip. The controller managed to get in touch with a local rescue technician who had access to scanning equipment used for detecting radio signals. The plan was simple: fly over the same region again, record any frequencies near the old coordinates, and see if there was a repeating signal. The pilot volunteered to fly. The others joined as observers. It wasn't an official operation, just a quiet investigation among old colleagues who couldn't let a mystery rest. They took off early in the morning. The sky was clear, the air cool and smooth. As the plane approached the mountain range, the pilot felt the same weight in his chest that he had felt every time he came near those peaks. But this time, he wasn't running from it. The technician switched on the radio scanner and began recording. For a long while, there was nothing but static. They circled once, twice, and still nothing unusual. The pilot began to think maybe he had imagined it all. Then, just as they made a third pass, the scanner beeped softly. The technician looked up. "Hold on," he said, adjusting the frequency dial. "I'm picking up something faint." The cockpit filled with a soft hum, then a broken signal. It was almost identical to what the pilot had heard before, a weak voice cutting through static. "Mayday. Mayday. We're losing altitude." The technician froze. The old controller turned pale. The pilot's hands tightened on the controls, his eyes fixed on the radio. "Record that," the pilot said firmly. The technician nodded, capturing every second of the sound. The transmission lasted just over a minute before fading away completely. The signal didn't repeat. They sat in silence, the hum of the engines the only sound in the cabin. The controller finally whispered, That was the same message." When they landed, they played back the recording several times. Each time it was exactly the same. Same words, same pauses, same tone. The technician checked his equipment twice, confirming it wasn't interference or a reflection from another source. "This isn't possible," he said. "The frequency pattern matches something from years ago. It's like the same message is being replayed." That evening, the pilot and the controller brought the recording to a technical lab in the nearby city. A group of engineers analyzed it overnight. The next day, the head engineer called them in. "We ran the data through every check," he said. "There's no current transmission source. What you picked up seems to match a recording from 2013. The controller frowned. "You mean the same as the one from the missing flight?" "Yes, the voice pattern, the static rhythm, it's identical. But there's one thing that doesn't make sense." "What's that?" "The timestamps inside the signal. Every transmission carries a hidden digital trace from when it's first broadcast. This one's stamp reads 2013. The room went silent. The pilot spoke softly. "You're saying we picked up a 10-year-old signal as if it were live?" The engineer nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I'm saying." The explanation they gave later was that certain environmental conditions might have preserved the radio waves, reflecting them between layers of the atmosphere and the mountain rock until the right alignment allowed them to escape again. It was a rare, almost unheard-of phenomenon. But even then, no one could explain why it had happened at the same place and almost the same time of year. That night, the pilot drove out toward the foothills of the mountains. He parked near a small clearing and stood in the cool wind, staring up at the dark outline of the peaks. Somewhere up there lay the wreckage, the voices, the unanswered questions. The mountains were silent now, but in his mind he could still hear the faint echo of the Mayday call. It wasn't fear he felt anymore, it was something else. A kind of peace mixed with sadness. He knew one thing for sure. Whatever had happened up there 10 years ago hadn't been forgotten. The sky had remembered. The mountains had held onto it. And for reasons no one could explain, they had chosen that moment to let it be heard again. He whispered softly to the wind. I heard you. I finally heard you. The next step was clear. He had to find where the signal came from. Not in theory, not in reports, but in person. He had to see it with his own eyes. And so the very next morning he packed a small bag, folded the old maps once more, and set out toward the mountains. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. Some journeys, he felt, didn't need an audience. They just needed to be finished. The pilot started his journey early in the morning, before the sun even touched the mountain peaks. The air was cold, the kind that bit through his jacket and made every breath visible. He had packed only what he needed, a small backpack with food, water, a flashlight, and the same old map he had been carrying since the day the distress signal returned. As he began the climb, the world around him grew quiet. The road narrowed into a trail, and soon even the faint sound of passing cars disappeared behind the hills. He had walked these paths before years ago during the first search, but now it felt different. This time he wasn't searching for answers in reports or voices. He was following something that called to him, something that refused to be forgotten. Every few steps, he stopped to listen. The wind moved softly through the trees and the rustle of leaves filled the air, but every now and then there was something else, a faint sound, almost like static. It could have been his imagination, or maybe his mind trying to recreate the signal he'd heard so many times. Still, it pushed him forward. By noon, he reached a steep section of rock where the forest thinned out. Below, the valley stretched endlessly, a mixture of green and gray. He could see the old airfield far in the distance, tiny and forgotten. He sat for a moment, took a sip of water, and looked up toward the ridge ahead. That was where the coordinates pointed. That was where the signal had always come from. He climbed for another 2 hours. The higher he went, the rougher the path became. Stones shifted under his boots, and the wind picked up strength. At one point, a cloud rolled over the ridge, covering everything in white. He stopped and waited for it to pass, his heart pounding. When the mist finally cleared, he saw something ahead, a glint of metal among the rocks. It was faint, but it caught the light just enough to make him stop breathing for a moment. He walked closer, his steps careful. The air grew still as he approached. Then he saw it. Half buried under snow and rust lay the remains of a small aircraft. The wings were torn, one side completely missing. The body of the plane was cracked open, covered in moss and dust. It had clearly been there for years, untouched. He stood there for a long moment, unable to move. His chest tightened as he looked at the broken fuselage. This was it, the missing training plane, the one that had vanished 10 years ago without a trace. He walked slowly around it, brushing off branches and dirt. The cockpit door was stuck, but he managed to pry it open halfway. Inside, the seats were still there, the controls frozen in place. A small panel on the dashboard was cracked but not destroyed. And there, under the control board, was something that made him pause. A radio beacon, its light faintly blinking. He froze. After all these years, it was still giving off a weak signal. That had to be it. The voice, the distress call. Somehow the beacon had kept transmitting, trapped in this forgotten place, waiting for someone to find it. He reached out carefully, brushing off the dust. The small speaker on the side crackled softly, and for a second a familiar sound came through. A whisper of static followed by the faint echo of the same message. Mayday. We're losing altitude. It played once, then stopped. He took a deep breath, feeling a strange wave of relief and sadness all at once. The signal hadn't come from ghosts or from the sky. It had come from this very place. Somehow, the equipment had stayed active, powered by an old solar backup that still caught bits of sunlight through the trees. But the part that made him tremble wasn't the machine, it was what it represented. This was the voice of a pilot who had once sat right there, trying to make it home, never knowing that his final call would echo across a decade. The man sat down beside the wreckage and looked out over the valley. The world was so peaceful now, no sound but the wind and the occasional bird cry. He imagined what that day must have been like, the panic, the confusion, the final message sent into the air, hoping someone would hear. He whispered quietly, I heard you. We all did. He spent a while near the wreckage, marking the coordinates again and taking photos to bring back to the authorities. It wasn't his job anymore, but he knew this discovery mattered. Someone's family had waited 10 long years for answers. Now finally, there would be closure. As the afternoon light began to fade, he started back down. But after just a few steps, he stopped. Something caught his eye near a cluster of rocks, a small metal tag. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. It was a pilot's identification plate, weathered but still readable. He wiped off the dirt and placed it gently in his pocket. The walk down was slower. The air grew colder and clouds began to move across the peaks again. By the time he reached the lower trail, the sky was turning orange with sunset. He looked back one last time, the wreckage barely visible through the trees, and felt a quiet peace in his chest. When he reached the base, he called the authorities. He gave them the coordinates, the photos, and the details of what he had found. They promised to send a recovery team the next morning. He didn't mention the part about the signal still playing. Some things, he felt, were better left unspoken. That night, he stayed at a small lodge nearby. He sat by the window staring out into the darkness. The mountains were quiet, but every so often he thought he heard a faint echo in the wind. Not a real sound, but something in his memory. He thought about how strange time was. How a voice from the past could cross years of silence to be heard again. How something so small, a flicker of radio waves, could hold on for a decade, waiting for the right moment to reach someone. He thought about all the flights he had taken since that day, all the skies he'd crossed. Flying had always been about freedom for him, about the beauty of the open air, but now it felt like something more. It felt like a promise. The next morning, rescue teams went up the mountain. He joined them, guiding them through the same path he had taken. When they reached the wreckage, they stood silently for a while, paying their respects. The technician who had helped him record the signal earlier also came along. He kneeled beside the old beacon and examined it carefully. "It's still working," he said softly, almost in disbelief. "A 10-year-old device still alive." The pilot smiled faintly. Maybe it just didn't want to stop until someone listened. The technician nodded slowly. Well, someone finally did. By evening, they had recovered what they could and marked the site for further examination. When the work was done, the pilot stood alone again, looking at the sky. The sun was setting, painting the clouds gold and pink. He whispered, "You're home now." He didn't fly for a few weeks after that. He needed time to let it all sink in. But when he finally did step back into the cockpit, something felt different. The noise of the engines, the chatter of the radio, it all sounded clearer. He no longer carried the weight of that unanswered call. Months later, when the investigation officially confirmed the wreckage as the missing training aircraft, the story made quiet headlines. There was no mystery left, just a strange scientific explanation and a small note about a pilot who refused to give up. But for him, it wasn't about headlines or explanations. It was about that moment in the mountains, standing beside a voice from the past, knowing it had finally been heard. And every time he flew after that, whenever he crossed that same mountain range, he made sure to switch his radio to the old frequency for just a second, not to hear the signal again, but to remember, because some voices, he realized, don't fade away. They just wait until someone's ready to listen.